Hola, bienvenidos a Padre e Hijo Discuten Cómics. Y vamos a ir a California. Ese era nuestro plan de viaje de este año, pero como por el COVID-19 no pudimos ir.
Entonces, uno de los objetivos era entrevistarnos con Dan Gvozden, que es el co-host de Amazing Spider Talk, uno de los podcasts en inglés que se refiere a mi superhéroe favorito. Entonces, él no habla español, entonces vamos a cambiar a inglés. Y thank you, Dan, for being here with us today.
It's so great It's so great to be with you guys. I loved meeting you back in California, and so I'm happy to kind of be talking to you guys again now.
Yeah, we were just explaining that our idea was to go and travel to California this spring
Again.
And have a meeting with you and possible interview you there. Because I'm not sure I have shared this with you, but our show started because I started listening to your show, and I thought that it was a great idea to spread the word about what we like. And in this case, you love Spider-Man, I love Spider-Man, so I almost feel like we are brothers in this kind of shows. So my first question to you is, at what age or when did you discover Spider-Man, and how did you become this great fan of the character?
Well, that's a great question. I don't really know the exact age that I was that I discovered Spider-Man, because I think, like most people, I discovered the character through a variety of mediums, like television. I really got into the trading cards at one point, and it actually, I think comics were one of the last stops on my journey to falling in love with the character. You know, I think in the 90s, when I was about 5 or 6, the TV show, the animated series, was on, and that became very popular. And I have to imagine that was one of my first experiences with it. I do remember my father introducing me to the character at a young age, but I can't remember exactly how. But I got into the trading cards. There were a lot of Spider-Man cards. And after a while of buying the cards, you kind of wanted something a little bit meatier. And that's when I discovered the comics. And the first comic I ever bought was an issue of Amazing Spider-Man. My father is a doctor, so he, was doing his rounds at the hospital, and across the street was a comic book store called the Twilight Zone. Still my favorite comic book shop. And he took...
Is that the one you interviewed recently about precisely what is happening right now?
No, I tried to get them on the show, but they were a little too busy to join me. We had worked out a schedule to make it happen, but it ended up not happening. I would like to kind of get them on the show. Their shop is very unusual, which is part of the charm. But, that's where I went, and my father bought me a comic, Amazing Spider-Man 375, so that, I could kind of, enjoy myself while he was in the hospital. And I've been hooked ever since.
Okay. Which one is that one? I believe it's the Michelini era with Bagley, but I don't remember the specific issue.
Sure, it's actually funny because it's the last issue where Spider-Man and Venom are enemies. It's the one where Spider-Man is trying to save his parents, which were robots, from Venom at I think it's kind of like Coney Island. It's like a destroyed theme park, and they get into this big fight there. And then the Wild Pack and Silver Sable show up. And at the end of the story, they make a pact where they decide never to fight each other again. But it's most famous for its cover, which is the Mark Bagley artwork of Spider-Man and Venom facing down against each other with a shiny gold, metal cover, which, any kid that saw that would be like, this is the greatest looking thing ever. I have to have this. And, I was hooked, like I said.
Yeah, I think I think I have that issue, but by that time I had stopped buying Spider-Man, because, as you know, it was the time when the Image boys went to and got Image Found, And then I was a fan of Todd McFarlane, of Eric Larson, of Liefeld. So I decided to stop buying Marvel and went to buy Image. So all that period is something that I didn't read originally.
What about your son?
Mexico,
What was his first comic?
I don't remember. I think it's Long Halloween, an issue of Long Halloween of Batman.
he's a Batman fan. He's more like a DC guy, right?
Yes.
He has some genes of his mother, so that's why he's not as fan of Marvel.
Well,
Do you like Spider?
Yes.
Batman's a great character too. I own a lot of Batman stuff too. I mean, I think of any of the DC characters, he's kind of the most interesting, at least to me. I love Batman.
Which era do you like the most about Batman?
I don't know. Everything about Batman is interesting, so
Okay.
it's difficult to find it.
So I was going to tell you that in Mexico they started to reprint in the 80s all the Spider-Man stuff. So I was very lucky to read all the 60s comics in back when I was at a very young age. And now Alan precisely is approaching the age that I had when I started reading like the Venom stuff, which was back in 1998, 89, sorry. So you have, and Mark, which is your co-host, a full collection of Amazing SpiderMans. When did you decide, and how long did it take to you to have each of these comic books? Because it's more than 800 issues.
Yeah, that's being conservative, and it depends on if you count the annuals or not, which I do. Mark's not here to defend his position that the annuals don't count, so I'll take the opportunity to spike the ball. But when I was a kid, I used to kind of just collect Spider-Man comics loosely. I didn't really know the difference between Amazing Spider-Man or Spider-Man or Web of Spider-Man. So it was really kind of whatever cover grabbed me. So for a long time when I was young, it was just kind of like whatever was coming out. And, if you know Spider-Man comics, shortly after issue 375 was the Clone Saga. And my young wallet couldn't afford all of those comics. So it really kind of came to be about like what I could find in back issue bins to entertain me, because I just couldn't afford the new stuff. And, that kind of gave me this kind of like collector's mentality. And when I was a kid, one of my closest friends, his older brothers, had these really deep collections of Marvel comics. And I used to just go over there and dig through their boxes and really get a joy out of like discovering new things that I'd never seen before, or that maybe I had learned about in the trading cards that I had been collecting. And so, I didn't really have an idea of collecting everything when I was young. And when I was in middle school, I went to like a summer camp. And when I came back, my mom had gotten rid of my comics. And
that's the story of all comics.
It is, yes. And to this day, she denies it. She says, no, I didn't throw them out. They exist, but they've moved several times. So you'd think that if they did exist, they would have discovered them somewhere. But they're long since gone. So that kind of, for a long time kept me out of the collecting idea, because it was like my collection was gone. And it was during the Clone Saga in the late 90s, and the Spider-Man comics just weren't really that good anyway. What really brought me back to Spider-Man comics was Ultimate Spider-Man in 2001, I believe. And, that was Brian Michael Bendis redoing Spider-Man. I remember my father used to clip articles out of the newspapers for me and give them to me and say, like, check this out. They're like doing a new Spider-Man thing. I know you like this. And it wasn't really an obsession of mine like it is today at the time, but I was like, okay, I'll check this out. And, I went and I bought the first issue of that, and I was hooked. It was just such a breath of fresh air, and it was really easy to get back into comics at that point in time. And because it was brand new. And so what I did ultimately was, get back into that. And then I was like, well, I wonder what I've been missing over an Amazing Spider-Man. Because now I was kind of old enough to know the difference between all of these comics. So that was when the John Michael Straczynski run was really getting going. And that was such a great jumping on point for new readers. And it, won an Eisner, and it was just probably one of the best modern runs of Spider-Man. And so I started off with going, well, I need to own all of these Straczynski issues. And once I did that, I was like, well, now I want to go and get the other stuff that I remember. And it just kind of grew from there. So I would say I don't think I really decided to start collecting Spider-Man comics like in its entirety until like 2008, 2009. Because I just was buying things loosely. But, eventually you buy all the Straczynski stuff, and then you buy all of the 90s stuff. And then before you know it, it becomes a snowball, and you're just chasing after this thing. And, it got really serious in the years to follow. But, I would say there was probably, 7 years of just hardcore buying comics to get the whole collection, which is relatively short. But I was like...
Was that expensive? Did you have to had a lot of money invested during those years?
It depends. Some issues are really expensive. So like my Amazing Spider-Man #1 was over $2,000. But like comparatively to today, that issue sells for like my issue that I own probably would sell for like $7,000. So like even a decade ago, these comics were a lot less expensive than they are today. I think the character has become so popular because of the Marvel movies that, not to say that Spider-Man wasn't popular before, but when I was buying it, it was during the like Andrew Garfield era and stuff, when it hadn't really become every kid on the planet's favorite character. And so the books have become very expensive. I'm very glad I was buying the comics when I did. But it was also helped out that the store that sold me my first comic, Twilight Zone, the guy who owns the store does not sell comics for crazy prices. He would really give me them for very reasonable prices. Like I remember, for example, there was one, free comic book day, which is something we do in the United States. I don't know if they have it in Mexico.
Yeah.
Okay, so great. So like he did a big sale on free comic book day, and it was like every back issue on a certain wall was $1. And so I went looking through the Spider-Man ones, and he had the full run of the Todd McFarlane Spider-Mans. And I went to him and I said, can I get all these for, $1 each? And he's like, well, those would normally sell for like $30, but if I marked it that way, you got lucky. So the real thing is if you set your eye on something and your mind on something for so long, and you set a certain threshold of what you're willing to pay, you can find stuff, in your price range. It's just a matter of being patient and knowing what is too much. Like a lot of stores are just there to rip you off, but there are good, honest places that will sell you comics. And my rule was I didn't buy a single one of those comics online. I had to buy them in person. And there's something about that just makes it more fair, I think. Like, people don't want to rip you off when they're doing it to your face. So, anyway, yes, it was expensive. It was probably like over $10,000 in comics.
Can I?
Mm-hmm.
And how did you have all the stories and all
the runs or what?
No,
the single issues. He has the single issues.
Because there must be difficult to have all.
To find them.
So yeah, some of them were very hard to find, and it's surprising what ones can be hard to find. Like you think, okay, it'll be really hard to find some of the really early Stan Lee, Steve Ditko ones. But actually, like they printed so many copies of those that they are relatively easy to find if you know where to look. And people like to show them off, right? If you own a number 5, it's going to be easy to find because it's going to be on your wall and on display. But like some of the comics from like the late 90s when Marvel was going bankrupt, nobody was buying them. So there's very few copies. So you have some really bad comics from the late 90s that maybe like they made 5,000 copies of. And so, you know, they're actually quite expensive. They can be like $50 for a really bad comic, if only because they didn't make many of them. So some of them are very hard to find, and you just have to stumble across them. But, you know, if you go to a comic shop that like the Twilight Zone, for example, they don't really sell many new comics. They're really about old comics. So there was a lot of stuff that came in and out through the door each week. And eventually you just kind of end up hitting everything if you have a checklist.
And you recently, you have a video where you are receiving a lot of packages of new comics from other titles of Spider-Man. Are you planning to complete all these other series such as Tangled Web and Spectacular Spider-Man?
That's a great question. So for a long time, when Amazing Spider-Man, my hunt for those ended, I said to myself, that's it. My collection is done. And then you realize that it's not really the comics that you had fun buying. It's the fun of collecting. And I missed that feeling, which is probably some kind of sickness. But
it's a thrill of the hunt.
It is, yes. So I'm back at it again, and so my old rules don't apply. Like this time, I can buy stuff online, mainly because Spectacular Spider-Man, Tangled Web, these are a lot less expensive than Amazing, and so you can find them online for like $1 an issue, and so I haven't really set the parameters for what that is. But because my show is now doing this kind of historical look through the history of Spider-Man, for me, the fun of it is now going to be owning the stuff that we talked about. So it may eventually evolve into owning Spider-Man records and some toys and stuff. I don't want to buy stuff that I just won't enjoy that will sit there. But if I think that like it'll be fun or it will add to my show in some way, I think now that I'm done collecting Amazing Spider-Man, it isn't that expensive to get all the other stuff. I kind of took down the monster first, and now I get to kind of have fun getting little pieces here and there.
Okay. Actually, my collection is a little bit different because I collect only what I like, and mostly in trade paperbacks. I used to buy a lot of single issues, and I still, for example, Amazing Spider-Man, I always buy the single issues, and maybe then I change into trade paperbacks, basically because of the space. As you know, the space is reduced, and especially in cities like Mexico City, you have to, this is my entire collection, and I have several kind of comics here. Now Alan has his own collection, and sometimes what I don't like anymore, you inherit that type of collection.
I am the treasure.
You have one question for?
Yes. Who you think Kindred is?
Who do
Kindred?
I think is what?
Well, he's getting into some of your recent shows. Kindred,
oh yes.
Who do you think Kindred is?
So I think that Kindred is the Mary Jane Peter Parker marriage made into a person. I think it's whatever part of their souls was taken away by Mephisto, and it has become like some kind of human being or personification, and that it's coming back to kind of like get revenge on them for giving it up or kind of like surrendering it. I know a lot of people have crazy theories, but that's been my theory since day one. And I think there's a lot of evidence to support it. But I think we probably have like 2 or 3 more months until we actually figure out who it is. I think issue 50 is going to tell us who Kindred is. But I don't know if you guys have listened to the show where we talked about our thoughts, but I think the Mary Jane, Peter Parker's first kiss and how their outfits that they're wearing during that kiss look like Kindred, to me, that is the giveaway. Like, that is the clue to who Kindred is.
Actually, one of our more recent shows was about Nick Spencer's run, and we discussed all these theories. And to me, originally, I thought it was Deborah Whitman because how she was managed in the past, especially by Peter David. Like, she was very vengeful of all the harm that Peter had done to her by not telling her his secret identity. But I think that we can skip that theory because of the recent Norman Osborn related comments in the comics. And then I told Alan about your theory, and I agree with you that it's going to be something like that, something that came out from Mephisto and all the pack, especially since Spencer is one of the things that he wants to resolve all these danglers from the past.
I think that is the daughter of Peter and
That's
Mary
other
Jane.
theory. Yeah. May Parker, the daughter.
Maybe.